Thank you all for coming. It's a delight to have you all here tonight, and I'm really delighted to have Dr. Dennis McCullough here with us. Obviously, it's quite a draw. So,
No, we can't hear you.
Okay, how's that? Very good. Better. Good, thank you. Dr. McCullough had started at Hitchcock in 1975, is what he told me. I had started there in 1979. My wife to later, so we've known each other for a long time and seen a lot of patients over the years. Dr. McCullough is a physician in family medicine and gerontology, and has, among other things, a book that he's written, My Mother, Your Mother, that he has copies of here, and it's also available online at Amazon.com. And without further ado, I'll let Dennis come up and start the show. Dennis.
Let's see if I've got volume enough, Stephanie. Oh, is it back there?
Still need a
No, not enough. I got this. Try again. Is that better?
No,
Yeah.
not much.
I'll use the handheld if it's nothing else. Hello? Better? But not quite good enough. No. I could start speaking to the front row and then you all can catch up. All right, good. Well, Bill called me and said that a few of his friends were going to show up at a small occasion and he wanted me to speak. And I happily agreed because, like many of you here, I am actually kind of a graduate of the Geisel School of Hard Knocks and Physical Therapy. And in any event, I was happy I'm happy to do this, and I trust that many of you in the room actually have been Bill's patients or clients over the years.
It's being blocked by your shirt collar.
Yeah.
Okay. That can be better. A bit sticky. Okay. In any event, we all have been under Bill's guidance and his staff, and for a period of several years, actually, when I had an illness, Bill was instrumental in getting me through it, not just by helping me to maintain my conditioning, but also emotionally and psychologically getting me to understand what it means to sort of bounce back. We had a conversation about what I should talk about tonight, and like two old guys, and there are many others in the room, so I can use that term comfortably. We decided that we should probably try to draw on our experience, and our experience is, in a way, we both share helping people get up off the mat. Many of you have had injuries or illnesses. You've had to go through rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is really a difficult and complicated process for people. So both of us are going to try to touch on the issue of resiliency tonight. I also wanted to talk about the third age and the fourth age. Are you familiar with that? It comes from the French. The third age is sort of a period of life where you've retired and you can do pretty much everything you want. You travel, maybe you have enough money to do all these things as well. We would call it recreational retirement in a way. You still have the energy to do stuff you want. But after that, according to the French and according to those of us who deal with older people, you get to a point where you no longer are in recreational retirement. And looking around the room, I can see that some people have probably crossed the threshold from recreational retirement into something which is more complicated than that, where you see yourself for your shortcomings and losses rather than the opportunities to do what you want. In a way, people say that 60 is the new 40. I had a wonderful older guy who used to come up with better ideas about commonly held truths. He was a statistician and a demographer. And he said, yes, Dennis, 60 is the new 40, but 89 is the new 88. So basically, there's this period of compression that goes on. And you can get away for a while talking about 60 being the new 40. But you run out of it after a period of time. But what I wanted to do is talk about this whole idea of resiliency. I could give a talk about how people get older physically. You get a little more hunched over, and men walk kind of with a wide base gait, and women tend to totter like this, and they fall more often. And there are lots of things. Our ears get bigger, our skulls get a little bit bigger, our noses get longer, and all of the organs slowly begin to kind of get a little weaker, including skin. I find when I garden now that I get a lot of bruising very, very easily. So we recognize that these physical changes are happening. But beyond that, there are some other important changes happening, and perhaps it's not so readily, it's not a topic discussed quite as much in our culture. One of my favorite films is a documentary called Surfing for Life. And it picks up the cohort of Southern California surfers who had their boards on these old woody station wagons, the old wood-paneled ones. And they surfed Southern California for a while as young people in their 20s. And then they found out that on the north shore of Oahu in Hawaii, there were some fabulous waves, so a whole bunch of them moved en masse to Hawaii. And actually, a couple of them in the film were on the faculty at Punahou School, which is where Obama went. So you get some idea of the tutelage he had over time. These were kind of long-haired surfers who were just doing a little teaching on the side, I think. In any event, the documentary follows the lives of these surfers as they got older. And there are three examples of people that I think define different kinds of perspectives on aging that are included in the film. One is a man who is still in his mid to late 70s, who is out there with these young guys on the north coast of Oahu looking for big waves. And there are probably some people in the room here who are in that group who would go looking for big waves until it was they were all gone or it was all over. So that was one kind of character in the book or in the film. Another character was a woman who continued to surf, but she surfed Waikiki Beach with its gentle waves and her two grandchildren on the front of her surfboard. That was her aging life. And then there was a man who, after he got into his late 80s, actually spent most of his time volunteering in a nursing home, helping people to keep their morale up. So there are three different kind of versions of what pathways to take as you age. One is highly physical, and the other is much more in that sort of caring mode. And then the middle one is very familial. So I think that if you look at what happens with aging, there are different pathways that people choose, and people are very different from one another. As we get older, we get more and more different from one another in every way. Physically, psychologically, our experiences are different. So we become very, very, very differentiated as we grow older. So I'm going to talk about three issues that I think relate to aging. One is sort of the individual one, which Americans are very wed to. The American culture of individualism really is a culture that says that the individual is probably the most important thing. You can kind of make your life, you can do what you want, And around the rest of the world, and I've talked a little bit around the rest of the world, we're viewed as a country where people feel that death is optional. And that's the extreme of individualism, and that death is optional. So one is the self. Americans tend, whatever I tell you tonight, you're going to go home and feel you're an exception to what I said, because you're all very distinct individuals. But what I hope to convince you of is that you're not entirely distinct from one another. The second, here's a wonderful book. It costs a lot of money. It's called A History of Old Age. And what it does is it goes into the arts and to literature to talk about how older people have been portrayed and viewed and understood over centuries in many different cultures. And it turns out that besides the long ears, long noses, and bigger ears and head and things like that, there are lots of other characteristics that people across cultures have had as they've aged. One of the entertaining ones that is mentioned in the book is that there seems to be a period of life in your 60s where you feel that you never have enough money. And this has been kind of true across cultures, apparently. Because if you don't have enough resources of your own, then you end up in that uncomfortable position of becoming reliant on others in order to continue on into old age. So there's an inevitable part to aging, an inevitable part. And that's a tough one for Americans and many other people, I think, to swallow. The third, beyond the individual, the inevitability of biology and other changes, is really context and culture. And this is a tricky one. The late American author, David Foster Wallace. I don't know if any of you have read Infinite Jest and other books like that. He committed suicide now, 10 years ago, something like that. But he gave what is considered to be one of the most extraordinary college graduation speeches that have been given in the last 15 or 20 years. And in that speech, he gave it at Kenyon College, and you can find it on great graduation college speeches. But what he talks about, because he was a wonderful observer of culture, so he looked at and wrote about American culture with a deep, deep amount of understanding. And one of the stories that he tells in this little graduation speech is the story of an old fish who is swimming through the water kind of leisurely. And he comes upon these two younger fish swimming toward him. And he says to them, "How's the water today?" They don't say anything and they go by. And then one of the young fish says to the other, "What's water?" So we are culturally swimming in water that we don't fully understand. And I think it's one of the key aspects of how we decide to approach old age and the way we think about aging. Because our culture is, as I mentioned, very individualistic. There's a feeling in our culture that a lot of things can be sort of delayed, like aging. And so we have this whole cosmetic industry that has to do with aging. Our medical system offers an approach which is to kind of live in fear of getting diseases, which is really focusing on the physical part of aging. And it doesn't do too much to talk about the other aspects of aging. So what I want to do is just touch base a little bit on some of the great thinkers about what is it about aging beyond just the physical changes and getting fit. Because I think that the getting fit thing is very, very American. That we think that if we simply focus on the physical fitness part of it, that much of our health will follow from that. And there's truth to that. As Joseph Campbell, the great professor of mythology, said, the reason we should take care of our body is that it's the only vehicle we have for our soul. But the focus is on our soul and growing older. And the work that's being done in gerontology and in psychology about aging really focuses, particularly when you transition out of that third age, where you're able, with good health, to really maintain pretty much the route that you want in terms of the life you want, into the age that's beyond that, where you can't any longer rely simply on physicality to become a resilient, and Bill, I hope, will talk more about resilience and sort of who does well when they run into trouble when they're older. And all of us will run into trouble. So the issue of aging in part is, how do you develop the kind of resiliency so that when you're in Bill and his staff's hands down here in physical therapy, or you're undergoing some difficulties in terms of a medical treatment or problem or any kind of problem, where do we find our resiliency when we age? How do we develop resiliency? By the time you get into the fourth age, and I would say that people begin to feel kind of fourth age-ish when they get into the 80 to 85 range. And if you don't believe me, just talk to a lot of people who are creeping into that part of life. That it's a changed world when you get beyond 80 for many people, though it is a bell curve. It also turns out that if you look at the evidence of the value of exercise and maintaining fitness as you get older, it turns out that walking is every bit as useful in terms of conditioning as anything else you can do. You might want to do a little bit of resistance training or gardening or physical work to keep the rest of your body going. But walking turns out to, and you don't have to be a power walker with weights in your hands, going as fast as you can. Just regular walking is probably as effective as maintaining fitness as anything that you can do. And this now is the fourth age. In the third age, you can do better. You can train and you can run the high hurdles in the Vermont Senior Olympics and do all of that stuff. But that goes away after the third age. You don't have fourth agers in the Vermont Senior Olympics anymore. They're in the Special Olympics. But we should have a special category, actually, for the real Special Olympics. A different age group. So Campbell has talked about maintaining the body as the vehicle for really advancing the soul. And the other thinkers I'm just going to talk about briefly are Erik Erikson, who was a student and probably the foremost American talking about psychological development with aging and the stages that he set out and the tasks. And the two places that he talks about or level or times of aging, one is the third age, really, it's 65, and he talks about the task there is not to become despairing. And the easiest way to do that might be to turn off your television and not read any newspapers. So there are some simple ways to avoid despair in our world. But there's a sense, some of the despair comes because we realize the losses that we're undergoing and also the losses that friends and other people that we know are undergoing as well. And so he said, basically, a lot of people go south, if you will, into despair with aging. And successful aging and resiliency really means trying to deal with that task of not becoming despairing when you've hit the first part of aging. And the thing that you're aiming for, he calls ego integrity. That is to say, you come to appreciate yourself for who you are and what you've done, and you feel that that is it's a stable platform for living in the third age, to really review your life to some degree and to move on forward. But in the fourth age, and Erickson didn't even talk about the fourth age until he got there. And then he realized that there was something beyond the third age and this whole thing about ego identity and not being despairing. And what he talked about is something called gerotranscendence, which is a great term. Okay, you're old and you kind of transcend things. You get a longer view. And I think this is what ties in with what David Foster Wallace is talking about with water. That as you get into this more reflective time of life, which Erickson has talked about, you begin to understand more deeply not just yourself and what's going on, but you can see the water you've been swimming in. You can see the environment that you've lived in. You can see your culture as having had an effect on you. And I think one of the practical and important ways, for instance, in lots of discussions that I have with older audiences, is that when you start running into things like medical problems, and a lot of things are being offered to you, it's very, very important to kind of have a read on what that force is coming from a very commercial medical system. And I can say that here even within a shouting range of Dartmouth-Hitchcock, because the U.S. compared to other countries is very commercially oriented medical system. And it's wonderful, wonderful in many ways, and it has bailed out many of us from difficulties. But there is a money factor that drives a lot of things. And realizing that some of the tougher decisions that you may have to make may reside in your having some degree of skepticism about the value of things as you get older. Because there's a huge literature in geriatrics that shows that trying to do everything down to the very end. And right now in many parts of the U.S., and I don't think it's true here yet, that the understood end of life is really to do all the treatments you can until you can't stand it anymore, and then you go to palliative care or hospice for a short period of time, get your morphine, and exit that way. There's a very technical view of what constitutes the right way to exit. That culture is not as deeply embedded here as it is in some parts of the U.S., but it's there. So when Erickson started talking about this time of reflection, he thought it was that as you aged, you did get to see the bigger picture. At the same time, there are so many people getting much older now that the bigger picture is not necessarily there because of the cognitive impairment problem that we see happening when people get particularly into their 80s and 90s, where about 1 in 4 people at age 85 will have some evidence of significant cognitive impairment. And by the time you get to 90, if you're wishing for that, then you flip the coin because it's one of two. So part of your life may really be in that zone. But there's a Swedish guy named Torsten who did more studies about this idea of gerotranscendence. And he said, it's not just a matter of adapting. He said, and he did a lot of surveys as a gerontologist and a psychologist in the Swedish population, and then hooked up with people in Japan, the US, other European countries to look at it, the maturation issues. And basically, he said, there is the opportunity through reflection to really gain a new level of maturity as you're older. And in the Swedish studies, he said that by and large people are happier. They're easier to get along with in many ways, although the dementia piece of that sometimes makes it more difficult. And you are a resource. You are the person who asks the question, how's the water today? And you're able to talk about the water to people who don't really understand kind of the forces that are driving our culture as we age. So in a sense, I think resiliency of the kind that Bill and his staff have experienced over time, and certainly the kind of resiliency that I've seen in my clinical practice taking care of older people, resides not just in going into this physically fit. It means going in with a perspective and some degree of reflection on where you are in your life and what you want to do with your life in the later years. So in a sense, the gerotranscendence idea is a time of great optimism, but you're not going to be in the Vermont Senior Olympics. I'm happy to take some questions here. I'm very close to running out of time. Bill asked me to do 30 minutes, and here I am.
Well, I did have a question about the achieving gerotranscendence. Are there any recommendations you can make about achieving it, or is it something that you just are more naturally inclined to do, or is it something that you can actually work towards?
Torsten actually designed some exercises, and one of them is an intergenerational thing. He said, the more you're able to come to look at the world with a sense of wonder, like who is it? The head of the school, Crossroads Academy, had a piece in the paper on Sunday about children and wonder. And he said, if you can begin to focus on the things that are just incredible, the things we don't know about life, the things we don't know, we don't have explanations for in the world. And sometimes we learn most of that by being with younger generations and seeing things the way they see them. So that's one example of a series of things that he put together. I think the other advice is that to make time for yourself to do reflection. And in his work he says that Americans feel that unless you're busy all the time, that you're not really able to, you're not living a full life. So he's one who says, slow down, and when you get into the fourth age, or maybe even start practicing some reflection in the third age, so you're more skilled at reflection when you get older. But that's a great question. It's not just an idea, but what do you do to get to that point? This is Campbell's The Growth of the Soul. Same thing.
I think it's kind of fun to write your memoirs because there's a whole lot of information that we have as older people that our grandchildren may not know about us, but if we write about it or talk about it with them, then it's something you can share or they can share forever.
Yes, that's a great idea, and there is the ethical will, of course, which is a strong tradition, I think coming primarily from Jewish culture on writing your story of what you want to not only have done, but what you would like to leave as your legacy. What would you like to be remembered for? The other important part of writing or even talking and listening is that there's this amazing phenomenon with aging where we have access to more distant memories better than we have access to what we ate for lunch today. Or did we even eat lunch? So, and you don't have to have dementia for that. It's just that the imprinting of memories from the distant past is much more profound. And if you begin to explore through active listening or conversation those earlier times, you actually can fill in a lot more details. Just talking about it turns out to give you access to a wider range of detailed memories for either writing or simply telling. Let's go.
I just had the good fortune to be on a safari in Namibia, and the oldest member of the group was 90, and she was absolutely amazing, did almost everything.
Yeah.
But we sat there the first night, and she pointed to her wrist, and she said, "I have a do not resuscitate bracelet with me, and I want you all to know about that. And she was so forward and upright, but she could outwalk, half the members of the group, but she had thought about it, and she had reflected, and she was very, very much a
That's a wonderful
wonderful
story.
member.
She did not have her Fitbit on. Do not resuscitate.
She did, yes, she did have two poles.
She had a Fitbit too?
She had two poles that she used
Two
to
poles that
enable
she
her
had.
to walk a little better, but she did almost everything, and her attitude was what was so.
Well, the thing that's changing in the world now, and I have a friend who's, I work with on a film series on Aging America, which is going to be coming out in about 6 months on National Public Television. But the difference is this, in terms of age. In 1950, there were only, in the U.S. Census, there were only 500 centenarians, people 100 years old or older. 500. In the year, I think it's 1998, there were something like 50,000, and then in 2007, there were 68,000, and now it's up near 100,000. There have always been old people. A few people made it that far. I mean, you read the Bible, read any old literature, look at a book like this, that many cultures have really recognized aging and talked about it and written about it and had art to do with older people. But the difference is that we're living in a culture with a lot more people who are going to be older, and adaptation within the culture is really, we're sort of a vanguard group on this, and there are 100,000 centenarians, and wait until the baby boomers get there. I mean, although you may run out of money in the town poorhouse, the poor farm again. Donald's idea. In any event, any other questions before I turn it over to Bill? And thank you for coming. It's welcome.